Hello, everyone. Welcome to the tour of the Museum of Southern Jewish Experience with our guide, Lizzie Meister. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, it's so wonderful to get to be with all of you today in the My Jewish Learning community. So whatever your background, the Southern Jewish Experience is a unique and relatable story, and we're going to talk about it here today at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. We're going to literally roll through our galleries, and we invite you to reflect on your own experiences of being a stranger in a strange place, trying to find your way into a community, the triumphs of working with your neighbors, and the feelings that you get when you're rejected and targeted because of part of your identity. This is a story that is multifaceted. There are so many Southern Jewish experiences, and I'm seeing people in the chat sharing where they are right now. I see some Southern folks joining us and some folks from all over, and I'm so excited to be talking with you all today. So, two pieces of information about this tour in particular. First, as I said, we're going to literally be moving around our galleries together. So there are moments that can get a little bit bumpy. We're also sharing a screen, our PowerPoint, that will be a close-up of the artifacts and images in the galleries. So if you would like to see a closer shot, that's where you should be looking. There'll be time at the end to ask questions. And I'll also be asking questions of you throughout that I ask you to respond to in the chat. So let's get started with a little background of the museum. Because we opened in May 27th here in New Orleans, Louisiana of this year. And then we'll talk more about our gallery. So this museum is a successor museum that was originally founded in 1986 at the Henry S. Jacob Camp in Utica, Mississippi. Utica is a small town, it's rural, and it's about 45 minutes outside of Jackson, Mississippi. So it posed some issues to try to get to the museum for most people. It also continues to be an active summer camp. So people coming in and out to visit the museum posed a security risk. So in 2012, the museum was officially closed at Jacobs, and a search for a new home was underway. In looking for the museum's new home, our committee, spearheaded by 3 of our board members, thought about places where it could have the biggest reach, and which Southern city didn't already have a Jewish museum. And New Orleans was chosen because of high tourist traffic. It's a really fun place to visit. We totally invite you to come down to the museum when you feel safe to travel, because New Orleans is a fun place, and we are excited to welcome you. Since opening, despite the challenges of COVID, we've had thousands of guests come through our doors. Our tagline, Shalom, make yourself at home, underscores the vision for the museum as a place where people can come together comfortably for conversation and for learning. So the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience tells 300 plus years of the Southern Jewish experience, and we work to tell it through a variety of viewpoints, through these bigger historical themes that mirror and reflect the experiences of many Americans at these times, through particular stories of place, and through individual stories of people. Southern Jewish history intersects with Jewish history and Southern history, and throughout our galleries, you'll see how these histories are reflected. Whenever possible, we view these bigger themes through individual stories told through objects, personal narratives, and digital interactives. Wherever you are in the US or in the world, you've likely had a Southern Jewish experience, and we're always looking for more stories to add. So as we go along today, I invite you to consider what stories you know, your story, your family story, your friend's story, reflects the themes you see in our museum. So the themes we're going to talk about are roughly chronological, but one of the things that I want to emphasize is that they don't happen exclusively chronologically. For example, we start with immigration, how and why Jews came to the South, starting first with port cities and then what drew them into the interior of the country. We know, however, that Jews continually immigrated and continue to immigrate to the South. So while we start a museum in immigration, it's not the end of that conversation. So we've grounded ourselves in the themes. Let's start talking about a timeline, another way to ground ourselves in our museum. So our timeline starts in 1585, I do that every time, in 1585, with the first Jew to come to colonial America, Joaquin Gans. And he came to the Virginia colony on Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition as a metallurgist and a mining engineer. So the history of Jews in America starts not in the north, as some people might expect, but the south, in the Virginia colony. The first Jewish settlement, of course, was in the north, in New Amsterdam, in 1654, more than 50 years after Joaquin Gans came. So the history of the Jewish people that was in the area that would later be called the United States started in the south. So as you can see, our timeline is pretty expansive. All I did was read this timeline to you all day. We wouldn't have a chance to get through the next 300 years. So I'm going to pull out some interesting aspects of our timeline that speaks to our museum overall goal. So in 1809, well, let me start actually in 2000 and 1920. So when the galleries were being designed, they were purposely thinking through ways in which certain perspectives hadn't been recorded and focused on in history. For example, the archives and objects from this time period certainly skew towards men, though we know that women were active and engaged decision makers at this time. By including these stories, we're enriching our understanding of the Southern Jewish experience while also telling these important perspectives. So now in 1809, Jacob Mordecai opens the prestigious Mordecai Female Seminary in North Carolina, which taught needlework and dancing alongside subjects that were often reserved only for male pupils, like math and Latin. Mordecai's daughter, Rachel Mordecai Lazarus, served as the head instructor and influenced her close friend and author, Maria Edgeworth, to confront anti-Jewish stereotypes in her writing. And then in 1893, the National Council of Jewish Women, Ncjw, America's oldest Jewish women's organization, was established. Hannah Solomon of Illinois founded Ncjw to address a lack of Jewish education and professional experiences. From the start, Southerners held prominent positions in this organization, including Carrie Simons of Alabama and Jeanette Goldberg of Texas. So from here, we can see that the Southern Jewish people were part of these national movements in Jewish life. So the Southern Jewish experience is not an insular one. So we've heard some of these specific stories that help us build an understanding for the larger themes we'll see in the museum. Let's explore some how and why Jewish people immigrated to the South, starting first with earliest immigrations during the colonial times. So most Jewish settlers in colonial America were Sephardic, with many tracing their heritage to Spain and Portugal before the Spanish Inquisition, and coming by way of Holland, England, and the West Indies. They settled in port cities in the Caribbean along the eastern seaboard and worked in trading industries. We see the earliest Jewish communities forming here. For example, Mikveh Israel in Savannah, Georgia, is one of the oldest operating synagogues today and was founded by Sephardic immigrants. While smaller in number, Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe were also settled in colonial America. They brought different religious, cultural traditions, sometimes resulting in friction of the more established Sephardic communities. Later, matching trends in immigration, Ashkenazi immigration eclipsed Sephardic movement. So now we're gonna move in our galleries, you might lose me for a second, to what brought folks to what pulled and pushed and pulled immigrants to the United States. So some Sephardic immigrants, like Portuguese Jews, were pushed out. They were forced to convert or to leave, while also being drawn to colonial America because of the promise of economic mobility. Some Ashkenazi Jews, centuries later, were pushed out of Eastern European homelands due to pogroms, civil unrest, and lack of opportunity. But they were pulled by the promise of a better life, as well as the opportunity to reunite with family who had already settled here. In fact, many of these are reasons that enticed immigrants at this time, regardless of religion. So when we think about these immigrant stories, we're all often thinking about these big picture ideas. But one thing that I love that you get to do with artifacts in a museum is talk about these individual experiences. So let's take these candlesticks, for example. somebody held these Shabbat candlesticks. They used them to celebrate rest. These particular candlesticks were brought over from Lithuania by parents of South Carolina legislator Harriet Hirschfield Kinserlig. They brought them over the United States, identifying that their religious practice and these candlesticks' history were necessary for their new life. Then the things that get saved and passed down, they end up in places like our museum. They have these deep and personal stories that we love exploring here. So this is the part of the tour where I'm going to ask for you to reflect on your own family story. So if you're in the United States and your family immigrated, from where did they come? What cities did they come into? And when did they move? If you would like to, feel free to drop your answers and responses in the chat, and we'll see all the different stories that are joining us today. I'm going to give everybody just a little bit of time to type all that out. Oh, I see some folks who came in through Virginia, through Hamburg, Palestine, from Poland to Alabama, and then Montgomery, and for a time in New Orleans, from Bavaria, Ukraine to Boston. I'm only reading them as they're popping up, so if I miss yours, I apologize. Thank you all so much for sharing your stories. So I'd like to add a story of our own. Around the turn of the 20th century, many immigrants came in through Ellis Island, though not all. About 10,000 Eastern European Jews came in through Galveston, Texas, which is how Galveston got the nickname the Ellis Island of the South. And bringing Jews into that port city was by design of other Jews. So at the time, there was a growing anti-immigrant sentiment in high living places like New York City. So Jacob, a businessman and philanthropist, worked to combat that sentiment by developing and funding programs in which new immigrants would come in through Galveston and be supported by Jewish organizations. Rabbi Henry Cohen worked with these new immigrants to find them homes in the interior of the country. So a fair number of Jews in the Midwest and the West can trace their family history through Galveston. Perhaps a Southern port city is in your own family story. This trunk in particular came in through Galveston in 1905 with Rothmail, who later went by Robert Shapiro. He immigrated to the US in search of political freedom and to avoid transcription into the Russian army. Shapiro's journey included secretly crossing the Russian border before gaining passage on a ship, which departed from Bremen, Germany, and landed in Galveston, Texas. So Jewish immigrants in the 19th century often journeyed beyond port cities like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans into frontiers of Alabama, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. Often arriving with little to no wealth, many found work as peddlers and merchants in the interior of the American South. Advances in railroad transportation, seizure of Native American lands, the clearing of forests and draining of swamps, and a booming cotton industry built upon the labor of enslaved people all led to the founding of these new towns. These outposts, eager for general stores and supplies, often counted Jews among the first residents. As towns grew, Jews found themselves intimately invested in the development of the American South. So now that we've established why and how Jews came into the American South, let's briefly explore some of the ways they made a life in a section we call Navigating Southern Spaces, which refers quite literally to getting around, finding a new home, and to becoming Southern. Because the mission of our museum is driven by diversity and acceptance, I want to talk about the complex identity spaces that Jews at this time were part of. So I'm going to read directly from one of the panels that help us better understand how Jewish identity was formed in the South in relation to racial hierarchies of period. Southern Jews' acceptance into white society was conditional and complicated. They faced discrimination, as did other ethnic groups, including Italian, Irish, and Asian populations, albeit in varying forms. Nevertheless, Southern Jews benefited from a system that forced African Americans onto the bottom rung of racial hierarchy. Southern Jews enjoyed opportunities economically, socially, and politically that were unimaginable to African Americans before, during, and after the Civil War. Many Southern Jews turned a blind eye to the racial injustices that benefited them, while others directly contributed to the injustices by owning enslaved people or through supporting a political system that kept African Americans in various forms of enslavement. From here, let's talk about how Jews interacted with slavery in the pre-Civil War era. Let's acknowledge that it's complicated and there are varying perspectives. In the pre-Civil War South, Jews owned enslaved people at the same rate as wider Southern society. In the museum, we have the bill of sale of a young enslaved person called Harriet to Kara Weisberg in Arkansas. Judah P. Benjamin, the first Jewish person in the US Senate, was also a key figure in the Confederacy. He served as Attorney General, Secretary of War, and then Confederate Secretary of State. And we can see his importance at the time reflected in our collection, as he was on the Confederate $2 note in 1862 and 1864. We also acknowledge that not all Southern Jews were pro-slavery. There were some Southern abolitionists, like Moses Elias Levy. So why do we tell this story? One, it's part of the Southern Jewish experience. Retelling and acknowledging these histories is so important. We can't shy away from uncomfortable stories or try to tell a single narrative. One of the things that I find really interesting about museums in general is they are, on the whole, really trusted institutions. A way we build that trust is to ensure that we're telling these multiple perspectives from the past, that creating an intricate story that is complex as the present. So as I just said, there are multiple histories happening at once. Before, during, and after the Civil War, Jewish Southerners were also literally navigating the land, working to make a living. One of the most pervasive ideas of the Southern Jewish experience is that of the peddler. The peddler went town to town selling his wares. He was often welcomed into these small communities, many of which were too small to have their own general store. In the peddling experience, we also get some pretty unique stories. So in this article from the New Orleans Crescent in July 1860, what I'm about to read, we learn more about the daily experience of peddlers. Take a listen and consider why this could have been a challenge for some Jewish peddlers. So the New Orleans Crescent reports that the fare is bacon and bread for breakfast, bacon and bread for dinner, and some bacon and bread for supper. We have bacon on the table and bacon under the table. So while some peddlers were not religious, others needed to be creative to meet the challenges of observance on the road. Southern Jewish peddlers often set out on Sunday or Monday and returned home Friday to rest or pray on Sabbath, where only treif or non-kosher foods like ham and pork stew and vegetables were available. Some Jews carried boiled eggs, while others ate what was served. So the experiences of peddlers are not uniform. Some peddlers made it. They accrued enough capital to start their own merchant store, and even fewer successfully opened department stores. But many others failed and took up a broad range of professions, including farming, teaching, banking. The list goes on and on. So the history of the general store is also complicated and fascinating. When you come to the museum, I invite you to explore our own little general store and learn about these individual stories of merchants, from butchers to dry goods to clothing and shoemakers. This is the Southern Jewish experience. So if you have a merchant store story in your background, we'd love to hear it. And at the end, I'll tell you how you can share that with us. So we're going to even move faster into the corner of our museum called Votes of Inclusion and an Age-Old Prejudice. These two strands of Southern history, Southern Jewish history that exist and converse with each other. And I'll start with votes of acceptance and then move to an age-old prejudice. So what we talk about in our in this section is Southern Jewish mayors. Over 200 Southern towns have had a Jewish mayor. On the map, the red stars represent towns with one Jewish mayor, while the blue stars represent towns with more than one Jewish mayor. Again, take this as a moment to reflect. Why do you think having a Southern Jewish mayor is of note? You don't have to put it in the chat, just reflect, in your space. So to me, these are a true indication of being part of your community. For these Jewish mayors to have built enough social capital for their town means that they have a high civic interest and that they're accepted. These towns, these more than 200 towns, weren't, huge Jewish hubs, but instead were places where, much like the rest of the South, about 1%, if that, of the population was Jewish. And these Jewish people accrued the social capital, were part of their community, and wanted to support the betterment of their community. So there are all these instances of Jewish acceptance across the South. And we also know there's a flip side. So I'm going to let you know that the following image can be jarring for some viewers. And also want to let you know that it's an effigy. So we have the historical record that tells of episodes of anti-Semitism. Perhaps the most famous of these stories is that of Leo Frank, a pencil factory superintendent in Georgia who is convicted of the 1913 murder of 13-year-old Mary Fagan. When his sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1915 by Governor John M. Slanton, a mob broke Frank out of jail and lynched him. The image you see is an effigy of Governor Slanton and reads, "King of the Jews." This case was very unsettling for Jews at this time, and it adds to our complex understanding of the Southern Jewish experience. We can see that the South wasn't inhospitable to Jews by looking at the experiences of our Southern Jewish mayors, but we can also see times and spaces where Jewish identity were fraught, and they were happening at the same time. So we're going to keep moving to an area of our museum that explores institution building. How Southern Jews built community through securing burial grounds, raising funds for synagogues, and establishing schools. There's so much here that we could talk about, but I'm going to focus on this beautiful quilt. So this quilt was stitched by the Sisterhood of Temple B'nai Israel in Canton, Mississippi in 1885, and it speaks to a variety of experiences. First, it was likely part of a fundraiser, raffled off, and had the women coming together to support their synagogue. But it also points to the ways that these communities weren't insular. Because during this time, there was a crazy quilt craze sweeping the nation, driven by the advent and popularization of the sewing machine. So the sewing machine was able to produce those fine lines, consistent stitches easily. So this type of hand sewing became less popular. Instead, the ability to creatively stitch and embroider personal images like flowers, keys, horseshoes, and even names was sought after. So groups from all over the world would come together to sew quilts just like this. We think about it as this beautiful metaphor of people being able to sew themselves into the Southern Jewish experience, that each individual square remains unique, but together we get this beautiful tapestry that is different and yet really blends together to make something beautiful. I also really like it because it tells us that the women of Canton, Mississippi were dialed into this popular trend. It reminds me of the 1880s version of the paint and sip. So we're going to keep going into a gallery that's outside of time. It's our Foundations of Judaism gallery. So this is also the part of the virtual tour where I have to warn you, it can get a little bumpy because we go from nice carpeted floor to tiled floor. So we're going to stick right here when we get there. So this gallery both creates an opportunity to learn more about Judaism as a religion for those visitors who want to learn more, but also shows how Jewish ritual objects have their own lives and experiences and meanings in our Southern Jewish context. Because we're going to welcome everybody at this museum, whether they're Southern and Jewish, Southern, Jewish, or none of those combinations. So what you're seeing above me is our 50 replica windows from 18 congregations across the Southern region, from Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox congregations. And we can see a variety of ways that Judaism expressed through art that adorns our holiest places. So as I said earlier, I'm not going to roll to this next image, but we're going to talk about this tali, or prayer shawl, that is on loan from the museum from the Lamonsworth family. The cotton used to make this tallis was grown on their family farm in Cary, Mississippi. So when the family has a need for it, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, it goes back to them to be used. This reminds us that objects in museums can and should be used in their cultural context. They don't necessarily have to be static behind glass. This tallis, however beautiful or unique, was intended to be used to wrap someone in prayer. So when we have objects in a museum collection like this, it is critical to keep the cultural use at the forefront of our mind. So let's keep rolling. So our next section called Entering a New Era, and it brings us into the 20th century. No, can you believe that we've gone through 200 plus years of experiences already? I'm going to explain this timeline and tell a few more stories. So in our 20th century gallery, we include the experiences of Jewish Southerners that had matched the struggles and triumphs of their neighbors and fellow Americans. From World War I, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression on a national and international landscape, and the impact of the boll weevil on the Southern economy. If you're saying, what's a boll weevil? That's a great question. So the boll weevil was a beetle that fed on cotton buds and flowers. And in the 1920s, it infested all of the US cotton growing areas, and it devastated industry and people working in the American South. So if you've heard of the Great Migration of African Americans moving from rural Southern communities to the north, like Chicago and Detroit and New York, that's the same story we're talking about with this. The boll weevil was the same impact the Southern economy. So what we're going to do now is focus on two landmark impacts to the Southern Jewish community, that of the Holocaust and the Civil Rights Movement. So we're going to roll up to this image of Ernest Barinsky. And I love this image as it leads us into our Holocaust Gallery. So Ernest Barinsky was a German Jewish professor. He fled Germany in 1937. Though he was qualified to get a job in universities across the US, he faced anti-Semitism in higher education. He was welcomed at Tougaloo College, however, a historically Black college outside of Jackson, Mississippi, where he taught his students war and peace, amongst many other topics. So this image that we have, we don't know exactly the stories. We don't have a transcript of what they were saying, of what was being talked about that day. But we know that his students had some sort of, him and his students had some sort of shared experiences with persecution from a society they lived in. So with that in mind, let's roll us into our Holocaust Gallery. So in our Holocaust Gallery, we tell the stories of Holocaust with a Southern perspective in mind. So Southern Jews served in the US military. Southern Jews had family and loved ones in Eastern Europe. Before, during, and after the Holocaust, Jews escaped as survivors and made their home and life here in the American South. We also focus on the experiences of individuals in this gallery and highlighting a person from each of our 13-state Southern region. We share oral histories of survivors and refugees, experiences of making a new home in the Southern United States. So we're going to take a moment to listen to Ann Levy, who speaks of her experiences with segregation on this video clip. Oh, I'm not hearing audio. Totally fine. This is also the part where we acknowledge the fun aspect of a virtual tour. So I'm going to share my screen and play back Anne's speaking. If everybody will roll with us for just a second. Oh, wait, you know what? Have to do one more thing. Thank you all for your patience. I'm sure this is not the first fun tech thing we got. If it loads. How odd.
I was worked at this time already, and I was riding buses back and forth to work, and that little plaque that said "colored only," it people would get on a bus much older than I, and I've been brought up where you're supposed to give your elders your seat. You know, you're the young one. Somebody older comes in, you're supposed to be polite, and I couldn't do it. And that it was impossible, hard to be able to move. I could sit anywhere I wanted, and it was very hard to move that sign just so I could sit in that seat. Because as long as that seat was there, no matter how many empty seats were behind me, the blacks could not sit there.
So Anne Levy so succinctly speaks of her experiences as a survivor. And keep Anne in your mind as we explore our civil rights section, because she is a key figure in that section as well. I'm about to surprise my fantastic tech crew, Krista, here at the museum, because we're going to take a stop that isn't actually already on our PowerPoint. So I'm going to ask her to come really close to the wall so you can see something that I think is really powerful. So if you can see my screen, we're looking at our documenting immigration wall here. And when I was getting ready to do virtual tours like these, our curator, Anna, brought me to this wall and said, this is a love letter to the archive. And I love that idea, that there are things that sometimes look static, like paper, that hold these very powerful histories. They hold people's family stories. And I'm going to share with you one of the family stories that we have on the wall today about the Dantes. So the Dantes, Uncle Dante of Charles Dante of Dumas, Arkansas, had nephews who were in Germany, in Nazi Germany during the Holocaust, and he worked really hard to bring his nephews to safety in Arkansas. And some of the ways that he did that was writing the Congress of the United States, saying that my nephews, they'll be really good citizens of the United States. And he also wrote the Dumas Chamber of Commerce, which I'm going to point down here. Once again, saying my nephews, they're going to be these really wonderful pillars of society. And this was just part of the process that Southern Jews and Jews across the United States had to do to try to get their loved ones safely out of Nazi Germany. And unfortunately, Mr. Dante was unable to get his two nephews out of Nazi Germany. But we know that this story is still impactful to his family today, as they donated these archives to the museum as a way to teach people about this really important history of what it meant to try to get into the United States during this time of lower immigration. I love thinking about these ideas of a love letter to the archive. So thank you for indulging me in that unexpected stop. So the gallery we're in now communicates, this is our civil rights gallery, and it communicates various perspectives that Southern Jews had of civil rights. Throughout this gallery, we see Southern Jews who openly supported segregation, while others worked actively for equal rights, and many more sat on the sidelines of history. One of the interactives we have in our museum is a never before heard perspective of Southern rabbis serving in Southern communities during the time of the civil rights movement. And it's also the subject of P. Alan Krause's book, To Stand Aside or Stand Alone. I hope that when you get the chance to hear these perspectives, as they tell this really complicated story of what Jews felt and did during the civil rights movement. As some Jews were targeted by racist groups for their support of the Black community, while others were actively segregationists. I'm going to pull us into the corner of our museum with what no museum professional should have, a favorite artifact, but these are mine. So these letters were written to the rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel in Meridian, Mississippi in May of 1968. Because in May of 1968, the congregation was bombed in the early morning. These are letters of support written by local children who attended Catholic school. And I love these for a variety of reasons. First, they tell us that folks in Meridian, Mississippi, not Jewish, supported their Jewish community, their Jewish neighbors. But we also hear from the voices of children. We see their tight cursive, something they probably recently been practicing, written to a rabbi saying, "We support you." And I love being able to tell young people when they come into our museum that their voice matters, that their voices from the past matter, their voices today matter. And it's really powerful. I also like to think about the things that I can tell young people that get saved that might not be expected. So these letters are written on loose leaf paper. So easily, the rabbi of the congregation in Meridian could have said, "Oh, what a nice sentiment," and put them in the trash. But instead, he saved them, his community saved them, and they ended up in our museum. So these are my favorite artifacts. Thank you for letting me talk to you about them. We also have a very long timeline here that starts in 1906 with the Atlanta race riots and moves throughout the civil rights movement all the way to 2017 with the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. But as I told you earlier, we're going to talk again about Ann Levy. So just as we started these two sections with the story that connects the experiences of the Holocaust with the civil rights movement, we clearly are reminded that Jewish people felt and learned what they learned deeply impacted their future activism. So Ann Levy, she in 1991 stood up to David Duke, who was a longtime Klan leader and radical right extremist, who was also trying to run for governor in Louisiana in 91. She used her experiences as a child Holocaust survivor to confront Duke's Holocaust denial during his run for Louisiana governor in 1991. So we hear this activism, these threads being pulled throughout. So we conclude our tour by reflecting on trends of the Southern Jewish life, starting in the 1960s and 70s with children and grandchildren moving away from small towns in Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas to booming cities like Atlanta and Dallas and Nashville. Small town Jewish communities watched their town numbers dwindle, and with them, their businesses, congregations, and ways of life. Jews moved away for a variety of reasons, including national trends of urbanization. And then finally, we end our museum with the future of Southern Jewish, with future vibrancies of Southern Jewish experiences. We talk about the importance and impact of Southern Jewish summer camps and youth groups. For many, their time in Jewish youth organizations might have been the only time they were around other Jewish people their own age. These connections that were made were life-changing, and we think about this idea in a section of our museum we call summer camp sweethearts, or people who met their partners at camp. I'm curious if there's anybody in our audience today who has a summer camp sweetheart or knows one. It also is a place of our museum where people often recognize others. If you've heard of Jewish geography, the ability to connect one small Jewish community to another large Jewish community, and suddenly you're 2 degrees of separation away from any other person, this wall is the place for you to visit. So in our last gallery, we also talk about ways that you can take the research and understanding of Southern Jewish communities on a personal journey. So you can explore the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, a project of the Institute of Southern Jewish Life that we have here in our museum to explore almost all, to the best of our knowledge, Southern Jewish communities and a history of them. So if you're interested in learning about Greensboro, South Carolina, you can read an in-depth encyclopedic entry into it. You also can add to your own quilt square to our Southern Jewish tapestry on a digital interactive. And then you can also dive deeper into our museum collection. So we look forward to hosting you here at the museum. We invite you to share your story of Southern Jewish experiences with us. You can visit us at msje.org/share to share your Southern Jewish experience. Follow us on social media to stay up to date on our programming and other initiatives. You can do that on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I spoke very fast today, and so we have more time for questions. That is all right. Which is very nice because I imagine that some people might have questions here today. So I believe you should be able to pop those in the chat. I wasn't reading. Great. I skipped the whole chat thing, so.
I did receive one already that said, can you talk about those parties that were held for young Jewish women to meet potential partners? Were they called jubilees?
If they weren't, we should have called them that. No, I don't know if they were called jubilees, but that is a important thing to talk about is when the Southern Jewish communities were just starting, they were often very small. So in our museum, the Southern Jewish communities were often really small. So you would have to go to town over, a few towns over, to a cousin who knew somebody to find a Jewish spouse. In our museum, we actually we have a wedding dress of Bessie, oh dear. Don't remember Bessie's last name, so that's my mistake. But she was a Jewish woman who found her spouse in that way. We also have stories of intermarriage. There were some Jewish men who weren't able to find a Jewish wife. And in some communities, the rabbi would still perform a Jewish marriage, effectively converting somebody. So that's a really wonderful question. And I do kind of wish they were called jubilees. Now I'm going to have to dive in the archive and find out if anybody did that.
Okay, there's a lot. Many of them are coming to me. One person asked, what was Ernst's last name?
Ernest Barinsky.
Barinsky, okay.
B-O-R-N-I-S-K-I, I think. I'm not a very good speller. That's something that I should probably work on.
Did Jews become mayors more than others? If so, was it because Jews had more education?
That's a very interesting question. I don't have the statistic in proportion to the rest of the wider community, if there were more Jewish mayors than the wider community. But there were certain opportunities that were available to Jews more often than others. So while there were Jews that were planters, farmers, many accessed wealth by accessing their merchant store, by peddling and creating a merchant store, which made them have a higher civic interest. And so that is part of that story, is that the way they connected to their community was through being an involved business owner or banker and wanting to see their community thrive, therefore becoming mayor or running for mayor and subsequently being elected.
So to clarify, because it's being asked a bunch in the chat, this is the museum is located in New Orleans. People are also curious about whether they can visit in person by making a reservation.
That is a wonderful question. So if you would like to visit us here at the museum, we're in New Orleans. We're about 5 minutes away from a bunch of other museums in the area, like a museum corridor. You can reserve your ticket online. We are open 6 days a week, actually not Tuesdays. So Wednesdays through Mondays, we're open from 10 till 5. And you can reserve a ticket online, but you can also come in person and buy your ticket. Come on down, we'd love to host you.
Another question I'm getting quite a bit of is, how did Jews who were slave owners justify that?
That is a wonderful question. So, like their non-Jewish counterparts, there was a variety of ways they justified it. One was an economic justification, which, at least to me, seems pretty inhumane, that it was more effective to have people who were enslaved working on your plantation or in your life than it was to pay them. But there was also a religious justification. So some Southern Jewish enslavers used the Bible, used the prescriptions in Leviticus and I think Deuteronomy to say that that slave ownership is okay if you do it in a certain way. So some Jewish enslavers would give their enslaved people a day off, would teach them to read and write, and that would justify their holding of people in bondage. But so there's a variety of ways that it was justified. It's a really wonderful question and something that we hope to continue exploring more of. Thinking about these individual experiences of Southern enslavers and how they justified that is definitely part of our continued research here.
Is Texas included in the Southern Jewish experience?
That is a great question. So I'm actually going to have Krista wheel around to our map of our 13-state Southern region. We go from Texas to Oklahoma, all the way over to Virginia, down to Florida. And this is just one of the ways the map could be drawn, but these are the 13 states we focus on at our Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. Texas has a big Southern Jewish experience. Everything's bigger in Texas.
Are the pictures of Mr. Henry Galler's tailor shop still there in the museum?
That's a great question. I will have to check that out. One of the things that I think is very interesting about working in a museum like ours is that every day you are looking at something new, even if you've seen it a lot of times. And so I'm very interested in Henry, oh man, I'm gonna have to write it down to see if Henry's tailor shop is still in our museum. Tailor. Oh, Kenneth Hoffman, who is our executive director, is in the chat, and he'll also probably be answering some more specific questions like that. It's a really great question.
Other questions that I've been getting a lot of include whether or not you have materials that educators can use for their classes.
Yes, we do. I am our public programs manager, and so I'm working to get those available to teachers. If you're particularly interested in knowing what we have available right now, feel free to email me at Lizzie, L-I-Z-Z-I, @msje.org, and we can connect with your specific classroom needs. It's a great question. We look forward to bringing young people into our museum and to working with them virtually in the meantime and continually.
Were Jews predominantly Sephardic or Ashkenazi in the South?
Great question. So at the beginning of the histories we talk about in colonial America, there were more Sephardic immigrants and Sephardic Jews in the American South. But we see 4 waves of immigration. The last 3 waves of immigration saw more Ashkenazi Jews coming in. And so the numbers switch around the immigration from Alsace-Lorraine, which is the first big wave of Ashkenazi immigration.
Okay, also some questions about what the oldest synagogues in the South are, as well as the afterlives of synagogues that were abandoned during migrations.
Awesome. So to the best of my knowledge, and this is sometimes debated, who gets to be the designation of the oldest synagogue. But to the best of my knowledge, Mikveh Israel in Savannah, Georgia, is the oldest operating synagogue in the South. If you feel like if you have a history that your synagogue is the oldest in the South, please put it in the chat. The oldest synagogue outside of the 13 original colonies is here in New Orleans, Touro Synagogue. And so many ways to say which one of those synagogues is the oldest. And the second part of your question, what happened to those synagogues as we talked about at the very end, these transformations of the rural South? People moved from some of these rural Southern communities to bigger cities. So that's in part the founding of our collection, was that these smaller Southern synagogues were closing, and they needed a place to house their Judaica. And some of it got donated to the museum. And it was at Jacobs Camp, Henry S. Jacobs Camp, so that young people could interact with it. And now it's here in our museum here in New Orleans. The buildings themselves have a variety of purposes. So I know in Lexington, Mississippi, for example, the synagogue there is now a church. There are synagogues in Louisiana that are now Ace Hardwares, like in Donaldson, Louisiana. So, you know, the history, where those buildings go is what the community decides, but some of that Judaica ended up here. Others also ended up in people's homes, back in their own personal family collections.
Another question comes from Eileen. Did the Southern Jewish experience include discrimination in housing, country clubs, or schools?
The short answer is yes, to some extent. I don't have like I don't have exact stories to share with you about that particular type of discrimination. And I'm confident that I could learn more. So one of the things that we cover a 13-state Southern region, and all of these experiences are very diverse, and we're constantly learning new ones. So if you have an experience like that, or your family has an experience like that, you can pop it in the chat. And you can also share it with us.
And just as a reminder, this will be made available both in an email sent out to everyone after we edit the video, and it will be available on the My Jewish Learning website to watch the presentation if you came in late or you missed it, or you were signed out. Let me check out a question. Okay. Did you discuss the garment industry in the South? I know there was one. My dad interviewed in one of the Carolinas and ended up in Texas. So questions about Jewish relationships to Southern garment industries.
Certainly. So there were a variety of industries here in the South that Jewish people were a part of. One of the things that I've talked to our curator about is this idea of not quite sibling networks, but cousin networks. So people who might have owned a garment factory or garment industry in one part of the country would send their cousin to go peddle or open a merchant store in a different part of the country. We also know that Southern Jews were deeply invested in the cotton trade, which cotton is used to, make garments. And so there's certainly a history of that and the familial ties that led to these garment industries to being spread throughout the interior of the American South.
Someone earlier in the chat, it keeps getting lost. I'm so sorry. So I'm going to paraphrase as best I can, which was a question about how because of the shrinking nature of some of these Jewish communities, there's been active recruiting in one particular city in Alabama to get more Jews to move there or to return. Is this a growing trend among Southern Jewish communities?
I believe that last I heard, that community was Dothan, Alabama. I haven't heard of any other communities that were doing that. That's not to say they don't exist. They're not quite on my radar yet, to bring more Jews to a town by like actively recruiting to ensure that the community stays large and vibrant, not just vibrant. very interesting question.
And another one here is, has the museum had any anti-Semitic incidents since its inception? Oh, and Mr. Hoffman has responded by saying we have not. Yes.
Yeah, I think he's spitting over his shoulder there. So yes, so far, so good. Awesome.
Okay, waiting for some more questions to load because there are a lot of beautiful experiences being shared. So I guess while we're kind of waiting for some more questions, I would be curious about how the museum delineates between what counts as a Northern Jewish experience and a Southern one. I would guess, does the South kind of start around Maryland, Virginia?
Great question. So we have stories from our state region is from Texas to Virginia. That being said, the experiences of Southern Jews can also mirror the experiences of Northern Jews. So that experience of perhaps being the only Jewish person in your town, having to drive far to get to synagogue, of working really hard to ensure that your kids get a vibrant Jewish community and Jewish education. Those are experiences that are perhaps likely mirrored throughout not only the Southern United States, the Northern United States, but also that of Jews all over the world. That being said, our 13-state Southern region was chosen for a variety of reasons, and we're collecting stories from Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kentucky, Virginia, and down, if I can do that as our outline.
So how are the experiences of Jewish women different?
Ooh, that's a great question. So throughout time, the experiences of Jewish women in the South looked different. So in the earliest times, if your family was the only Jewish family in an area, you were responsible for making sure, or made yourself responsible for making sure that your family got a Jewish education, were doing things that felt meaningful to you. Because of the prevalence of male peddlers, some Jewish women held down the fort and made important economic decisions for their family as their husbands were away or their partners were away. And so that's kind of the earliest story. And throughout time, I think you see that idea coming forward, the importance that people have, regardless of gender, in making important decisions and being part of a community, of stepping up to the community, making sure that that their Jewish experiences were happening.
So we have a lot of really wonderful experiences being shared in the chat. I'm wondering if you, okay, great. And Kenneth also replies to say, it takes about 90 minutes to work your way through the entire museum. Okay. So I'm wondering if, do we kind of wrap up here?
I think that would be wonderful.
I just want to be considerate of your time.
That would be wonderful. So again, if you would like to follow us and keep up to what we're doing here at the museum, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Consider becoming a member of the museum. You'll receive admission to the museum, a discount off of our store, and also like invites to our programs that will continue to be virtual as well in person. And we really appreciate you coming to listen to our tour today. If you would like to engage or have any questions, please email info@nsje.org, and to share your stories, msje.org/share. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. I will now be closing the window. Once again, this will be available as a recording on our website, and it will be emailed out to you as soon as it is fully edited. Have a wonderful day.
Shalom, y'all.